Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time zone you are joining us from. My name is Ariel Agenbroad, and I'm with University of Idaho Extension. And today's webinar is Produce Safety on Small Farms, Preparing for the Food Safety and Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule. This presentation is a joint effort between University of Idaho Extension, Washington State University Extension, University of Alaska Fairbanks Extension, and Oregon State University's Extension. We've been funded by the USDA NEFA to host a series of training opportunities for small farmers and small producers, and helping them get ready for produce safety and also food safety. So we'll talk more about that later. Helping me with today's webinar and providing us the platform for hosting is Amanda Snyder with Cultivating Success. And so you may have received some emails from her, and you will in the future when this webinar is recorded and put on the Cultivating Success website. And we'll give you another website where it's going to be located when it's been recorded as well. And we will be replaying this webinar, doing it one more time on May 14th. So if you or any of your staff or employees or anyone you know in your farming community could benefit from this webinar, let them know, and they can register for the May 14th, or they can watch the recording. The benefit of watching it live is that you have the opportunity to ask and have questions answered. So we're going to get started. A few housekeeping tips before we get going. The webinars will work best if you have other programs not running on your computer. So close other things that are using bandwidth like email or websites or social media. If you're having problems with sound, there are some features of Zoom where you can click to test your speakers or to test your sound. If you're having issues, you can also put them into the chat or question box, and we can try to address them, but typically the sound issues are on the user side, unfortunately, so we can't always troubleshoot for you. If you really are getting no sound or the webinar is freezing up, etc., then it might just be a connection issue, and in that case you might want to call in with the phone number that was provided in your welcome email when you registered. And then when you're using your phone to get the sound, mute your computer sound or you'll get some very strange feedback. If you have questions as we're going along, feel free to type them into the question box. We will have time at the end for questions, so if we don't answer them during the presentation, we will have some question and answer time at the end. And then we will be sending you some handouts related to this webinar. There's a few things that I'm going to mention that you might want to have hard copies of or digital copies. So we'll tell you about those, and those will be available later following the webinar. So just to get us started, I wanted to just set the stage for what we're doing here and what you came here to learn. So FSMA, some of you may or may not have heard this term before. You might have heard it, but you're not sure what it means. You might have heard it and it struck terror into your heart. Really don't know where you all are coming from because I can't see you and I can't talk to you directly. But we're going to talk about what it means and how it relates to you. So what we're talking about when we say FSMA or FSMA is the Food Safety and Modernization Act, or FSMA for short, which was signed into law on January 4th, 2011. That's quite a long time ago, but it's taken a very long time for the rules to be finalized and for us to unroll education and outreach as the states. So this is a federal law of the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. And this act, gives FDA the authority to regulate food. And from farm to fork, FDA has always been, or has for a long time, been involved in regulating food products, restaurants, any kind of prepared food. This is the first time that they have been given authority to regulate food on the farm. And the idea is that it establishes science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fresh fruits and vegetables. And that's primarily the produce rule that we're going to talk about. And it is the first sweeping food safety regulation overhaul in a very, very, very long time, probably the first in any of our lifetimes. The produce safety rule is just one of 7 new federal rules that go along with FSMA, and all of these rules pertain to food production, processing, transporting, and importation in some manner. There are, like I said, there are 7 rules. The produce safety rule is one of them, and other rules include the preventative controls for human food, and this is related to processed or manufactured food products. And we will be doing another webinar and some additional trainings related to this and how it might apply or does not apply to small scale and value added food processors. There's also a preventative controls for animal food. So this is, you know, people who are working in the manufacture and distribution of pet and some livestock feed, and then sanitary transportation of human and animal food. And there are 2 others that more relate to international trade and international food. But the one that we're going to talk about today is the produce safety rule. So hang on just a minute, and I'm going to pull up a video. And it worked when we practiced, so I'm really hopeful that it's going to work now. And this is a video that we developed in Idaho, but it's really just an introduction to the produce safety rule, and it's really applicable potentially to you wherever you're calling from or tuning in from.
Welcome. This is the first video in a series prepared to educate you on 21 CFR Part 112, Standards for the Growing, Harvesting, Packing, and Holding of Produce for Human Consumption, also known as the Produce Safety Rule. The Food Safety Modernization Act is a science-based approach to proactive food safety from field to fork. This act includes the farthest-reaching changes to food safety laws in the United States since 1938, and is focused on preventing foodborne illness outbreaks by reducing microbial risk. The Food Safety Modernization Act includes 7 new federal rules that address the safety of produce, human food, animal food, transportation, and imported food. The Produce Safety Rule focuses on on-farm activities and established science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce, which is generally consumed raw. The Produce Safety Rule requires operations that conduct these activities comply with the standards set forth in this rule. The Produce Safety Rule sets standards for personnel qualifications and training, health and hygiene, agricultural water, biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste, domesticated and wild animals, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, equipment, tools, buildings, and sanitation, sprout production, and last but not least, record keeping. As you see here, operations started complying with the standards of the Produce Safety Rule in a staggered schedule, which began in January 2018, with regulatory inspections beginning in 2019 for certain operations. We hope this information is helpful to you as we move forward into these training videos. We have separate video training modules for each part of the Produce Safety Rule. These video modules can be used to teach specific standards and sections of the Produce Safety Rule, or for training about the rule in its entirety. If at any time you have questions regarding how the Produce Safety Rule might apply to you, or what compliance with the rule will look like moving forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Idaho State Department of Agriculture or University of Idaho Extension.
So you're welcome to reach out to University of Idaho or the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. But if you don't live in Idaho, that's all right. We're going to talk about where you can find this information in your own state if you are attending from a different state. All right, so hopefully that was seamless. We're back where we were. All right. So why is food safety and why is the Produce Safety Rule important? Well, if we look at historically, even in just 2015 alone, the Centers for Disease Control documented that there were over 902 foodborne disease outbreaks reported. And this resulted in 15,000 illnesses, 950 hospitalizations, 15 deaths, and 20 food recalls. And these are just the ones that are reported. Generally, if there is death or hospitalization involved, then these are going to be reported because the source of or the because of the foodborne illness is going to be known. However, think about if you have ever suffered from a foodborne illness, or if you've ever felt like you've gotten food poisoning from a restaurant or for something that you've made at home, have you reported that to the CDC? Generally no. And I just realized that CDC is not CDD. I'll have to work on that. When we look at what food categories were associated with the most outbreak illnesses, we look at the #1 cause of these foodborne illness outbreaks is seeded vegetables such as cucumbers or tomatoes, and in some cases peppers. Followed by pork, and then vegetable row crops such as leafy vegetables. So this really does apply to anyone who's producing these kinds of foods. So who or what is to blame? Really, where is this coming from? Well, what's causing these foodborne illnesses are bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And you might say, well, these don't naturally occur in our produce. And that is true, but they do naturally occur in the environment, and they can be easily introduced. And in many cases, produce is the perfect conveyor and the perfect home for these types of pathogens. So no farm is too big or too small to be implicated. There have been farms of all sizes associated with outbreaks, from very, very, very large conventional production farms to small farms as well, and even farmers market vendors. But data doesn't tell the whole story because, like I said, many cases are going to go unreported or unidentified, and person-to-person transmission is really often not included in the numbers. So you may get a foodborne illness from from a produce or from something you eat, but then you could pass that on to other people in your family or your workplace or your community, and it would be very hard to trace that back to the original cause, which would be something food related. So why are we here today? Why are we talking about this? Why did you join us on this webinar? Well, many small farms are not going to be required to comply with all of these new food safety regulations. You may have heard that, you may already know that, and that's going to make things potentially a little bit easier for you. However, all farms, no matter of size or scale or where or how they sell their food, are responsible for producing, packing, transporting, and selling safe food. Like I said, size doesn't necessarily preclude anyone from these risks or from potentially making someone sick, and no one wants to do that. How the rule will affect you and your farm is really going to depend on what you grow, how much you sell, and who your customers are. And so we'll talk first a little bit about how do you know if the rule applies to you and in what manner you're going to be expected to comply with it. So first, though, I want to talk about what produce is subject to the rule. So this is the rule talks about covered produce. So this is what is covered by the rule. And they, of course, shorten this to RACs, or raw agricultural commodities. I can just see a spelling error there too. My goodness, I need to double check this PowerPoint. These raw agricultural commodities can be any produce item except what is on the following list. So FDA made a list of produce that is not subject to the rule. And anything that is not on this list is potentially subject to the rule. And I know that's kind of an odd concept, but these are the things that the rule does not cover. Even if potentially someone is eating them raw, the likelihood of them being eaten raw is much, much less. And so they are not considered a raw agricultural commodity. So this is asparagus, beans, black beans, northern beans, kidney, lima, navy, pinto, beets, garden beets and sugar beets, cashews, cherries, sour, so only sour cherries, chickpeas, cocoa beans, coffee beans, collards, corn, sweet corn, cranberries, dates, dill, both the seeds and the leaves, eggplants, figs, ginger, hazelnuts, horseradish, lentils, okra, peanuts, pecans, peppermint potatoes, pumpkin squash, both winter, just winter squash, sweet potatoes, and water chestnuts. And this is a list that FDA developed, and it was based on things that people are most likely to cook before eating. And so cooking introduces a kill step that generally can do away with those harmful pathogens. And so these are the things on their list. If it's not on this list, you can probably expect that the rule will cover it. So if you grow any of those things exclusively, right, if you only grow sweet corn, you are not going to be subject to the rule. So what else is not covered by the rule? Well, farms which do not grow any of those foods that are commonly consumed raw, right? So if, like I said, if you don't grow any fresh produce, then you're not covered by the produce safety rule. If you grow on your farm, but you only consume everything you grow, nothing is sold, you're also not covered. Even if you're a large farm and you grow a whole lot of food, if it's all for personal and family consumption, it is not subject to the rule. If you grow some of those raw agricultural commodities, but you take them specifically to processing, so you grow tomatoes, but all of it goes to tomato sauce, or you grow apples, but it all goes to applesauce, then those are not you're not going to be covered by the rule, but you do need to keep some documentation about how to document that processing is happening, and that could just be sale records of showing where you sell your products. And then if you gross $25,000 or less in produce sales over a 3-year average each year, then you are not going to be covered by the rule. The FDA is not interested right now in inspecting or covering these very, very small farms. So you might have, so those are the groups that are not going to be affected or covered by the rule at all. However, there are some middle range folks that are going to be exempt from the rule. And I have a star there because exempt doesn't mean that you don't have to comply. It just means that you have to follow certain practices and certain record keeping. So farms that sell $500,000 or less of total food. Now this is interesting. It does not say produce, it says food. And so this is not only produce, but it would be anything on that other list. It could be any kind of processed food, and it could also be animal food. So $500,000 or less of total food for humans or animals. So if you sell under that limit, you might be eligible for a qualified exemption. And so you make under $5,000 or less on your total food, and you sell 50% or more of your products, and again, it doesn't have to just be produce, it can be any of the foods that you grow. If you're selling them to a qualified end user, then you might be eligible for this qualified exemption. And a qualified end user includes a farmer's market customer, CSA customers, retail grocery stores, farm stands, co-ops, and restaurants. So this is about shortening that path from your farm to the end user. If you're selling to a distributor, that does not qualify as a qualified end user because that produce is potentially going in a much wider range. So these are these direct market avenues for selling. So like I said, exempt does not mean totally exempt. Exempt means that your farm will not be subject to inspection or most of the documentation associated with the rule. However, it does not protect you from complying with the rule if a foodborne illness or outbreak is traced back to your farm. So if something that you grow makes someone sick, then you pretty much forfeit your exemption and you will start to be inspected under the rule. And then you're also required to keep records that document your qualified exemption. And we'll talk about this at the very end. We'll come back and revisit the record keeping requirements. So just know that a qualified exemption, it means that you will not be inspected by a state or federal regulator, but it does not mean that you don't have to pay attention to the rule and that you can just ignore it. So how do you know if you are covered? Well, you may have already started going through this process. We have developed some tools for you to help figure this out. We're working on some more for other states besides Idaho to figure this out. FDA has some flow charts, and then we're going to share a resource with you at the very end, a website that has some other places that you can go and find this information. So to find out if you are covered by the rule, you're going to need to have some information assembled before you start this. You need to know the types of produce that you grow, your annual gross sales of your produce, your annual gross sales of all the food that you produce and sell on your farm, the percentage that is sold directly to a qualified end user, and again, that is you're an individual or a family through a CSA or farm stand or farmer's market, to a restaurant or to a local grocery store or retail food store or co-op. So you need to know these bits of information, and that will help you to determine whether you fall under not at all covered, qualified exempt, or fully covered. So what if it looks like you might actually be covered? You are selling over that $500,000 mark, or you're not selling 50% of it to a qualified end user. Well, if your farm does not meet those requirements for an exemption or a qualified exemption, then you'll likely be required to comply with all parts of the produce safety rule. And this just means that you're going to have more record keeping, and you will potentially be inspected by a state or federal regulator inspector starting in 2019, which is now this year. So if you are you think that you might be covered, it's really a good idea to start having a conversation right now with your university extension representatives or your state Department of Agriculture or whoever is managing FSMA for your state. I think of all the states in our 4-state project, I think Oregon is the only one whose State Department of Agriculture is not going to be the regulator for FSMA. So talk to them about how to prepare, how to get appropriate training, and we also do offer something called an on-farm readiness review, which walks you through what an inspection would look like. So you saw this on the video. I just wanted to point out, these are some compliance dates that may affect you. What's really important for you to know as a very small farmer or a qualified exempt farmer is that you need to have records or access to records going back to 2016 showing your total sales of food and who you sold it to. And I don't mean the individual, like I sold 6 pounds to this person, but the markets and the percentage of your sales coming through each different kind of market, whether CSA or farm stand or direct to retail or restaurant. And then we're going to talk about labeling requirements. That's going to be getting going in 2020. So you still have some time to prepare for that. So what does the rule do? Well, it enlists a science-based proactive approach to managing food safety risks on farms and farm facilities. So it tries to look at what scientifically causes foodborne illness and outbreaks and contamination of produce, and works to go back from that and really focus on prevention. And so it sets some standards for all these different activities that have to do with producing food. And it does require some very specific requirements, so things that you must do to comply with the rule. And it also includes a whole bunch of suggested activities or best practices. And sometimes it's hard to navigate through these, especially when you're faced with, many, many pages of federal code language. But generally, if it says you must, then that means that you must. And if it says that you should, it means that that's probably a really good idea, but it's not a requirement under the rule. So some of you may be familiar with GAP or have some experience with GAP. I'll define that in a second. But like GAP, this rule focuses on preventative best practices that will minimize the food safety risks on your farm. And it really is meant to protect the farm and the consumer both from what can happen if someone gets sick from your food. And it does require some similar record keeping or documentation. So if you are GAP certified, you're already keeping several records that will satisfy the record keeping requirements of the produce safety rule. However, unlike GAP, and these two things are really not synonymous, at least not right now, GAP or Good Agricultural Practices, this is a third-party certification audit that is really market-driven. So it is often required by a distributor, a large retail market, an institution, or a school as a safeguard if they're going to accept or purchase your products. So no laws require you to be GAP certified, just the buyer would require you to be GAP certified. However, FSMA produce safety rule is different because these are federal laws and they affect all farmers whether they're aware of them or not. And that's partly the reason that why we're here and we're doing these webinars, because we don't want you to be caught off guard. We don't want you to be surprised by this. We want you to know where and how this rule affects you and how to be prepared and not frightened by it. So we mentioned briefly in the video what is addressed in the rule. Well, there are these different sections, and we're just going to really briefly touch on them today. We're not going to go in depth, but if you will look at our webinar schedule, we have a number of these coming up that's going to go much more in depth in each of these different modules and what's really recommended and how you can prepare and be just as food safe as possible. So the first thing that the rule covers is personnel qualifications and training, right? So who's in charge of food safety on your farm? What do they need to know? How do you train people on your farm, your employees, your staff, your family members? Small farms don't always have employees. Health and hygiene, right? What practices are reducing risk from human pathogen contamination? And at its most basic, we're talking about poop and germs. This is where most of these illnesses come from or how they're transmitted. And so we look at how you can reduce this risk a little just through the health and hygiene of everyone involved in the food production. And then it goes back to that personnel qualifications and training, right? How are you teaching people these things? The rule also covers agricultural water. This is probably the most controversial. It's the one that has required the most change and discussion. It's because it's the most diverse. If you look at agricultural production across a given region, across a state, or even in the nation, no two producers are necessarily watering in the same way or using irrigation water in the same way. So this is really an important one. And this is both about water that you use in the field and water that you use outside of the field. So anything that you use to grow, cool, and clean your crops. And how does it pose a hazard? Another section is biological soil amendments of animal origin and human waste. So this covers how manures and composts are managed on your farm, what are recommended or allowable uses of these materials, and what do we want to try to do to be safe when we're using them. It also talks about domesticated and wild animals. So what can you do to reduce the risk of contamination by wildlife, livestock, and pets? And you might say, well, I can't do much about wildlife. And we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit. But this is the section that covers that. And partly because this is often how manure or poop is introduced into the farm. So the rule also talks about growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities. So this is everything from field to pack house to market, and what practices reduce risk. How do we maintain that high level of produce safety all the way through? And then it covers equipment, tools, buildings and sanitation. So looking at the facilities that you have and your equipment, everything from a harvest tote to an end market container. How do you make sure that those things stay clean? How do you identify and fix risky situations? And how do you manage pests? And then lastly, the rule covers record keeping. So what are the required records that one needs to keep depending on their level of coverage in the rule? And what makes good sense to track in your operation? So there are some things that are required. There are some things that are not required but recommended. And how do these all fit together? So that's the record keeping section. So what does this mean for you as a small farmer? Number one, find out where you fit into the picture, right? Are you covered? Are you growing produce that is covered by this rule? Are you exempt? Are you qualified exempt? Second, once you know what level of compliance or not you're going to need to do, then understand which records you need to keep in order to document and prove your exemption. So the exemption, you may not have to comply with the rule, but you have to prove that you're exempt. And that requires some record keeping and some documentation, which we'll talk about at the end. And then third, realize that the practices outlined in the rule will reduce the risk of produce contamination on farms of any size. So you may think, well, I'm not big enough to really have any issues. But there are lots of ways that small farms can make small changes to greatly increase their food safety and reduce the risk. And I really think this is important because a small farm has so much to lose. Typically, they don't have the kind of liability insurance potentially that a large farm would have, though it's a really good idea to have as much as you can afford. But just realize that you're vulnerable if something is to happen, and the safer you can be, the more you reduce that risk. And that's a good idea both for the longevity and the profitability of your farm, but also for the trust and the health of your clients and customers. And all the farmers that I know, that's why they farm. They want to grow healthy, delicious food for the people in their communities. So now we're going to take some time to go over each of the key elements of the rule and talk about them just really briefly in terms of small farm production. And like I said, for a number of these elements, we're going to be having a separate webinar that goes into depth on these. But so this is just tip of the iceberg. We're going to go over the personnel, the health and hygiene, the soil amendments, the animals, the post-harvest activities, the transportation, and the record keeping. So you might be thinking, does this really apply to me? And again, I can't say enough that even if you are an exempt or qualified exempt farm, you are not necessarily required to keep all the records for the practices presented in the next section. But as these practices will lead to increased food safety and sometimes food quality on your farm, it's really important to learn as much as you can about them and think about incorporating some of these recommendations into your production. And also something to think about, you know, if you want to grow and you have goals to be a more profitable farm in the future, as your business grows and you sell more product, you may end up being compliant. So it's good to know about it now. So let's talk about the personnel and the human angle of things to get us started. So this is important, especially because small farms are often very human powered. There is a lot of hand labor typically, and it's really reliant more on human than it is on mechanization. So humans are a major food safety concern, and that's because people are usually the #1 transmitters of pathogens, both to produce and to each other. So we can contract, share, and transfer pathogens when we're sick, when we're injured, by blood or bodily fluids, when our hands have been contaminated by human feces, by animal feces and manures, by any kind of surface clothing, footwear, tools, and equipment that has come in contact with any of those items, and contaminated water. And I didn't put a slide specifically in here, but we're looking at things like Listeria, Campylobacter, E. coli, Salmonella. So these are some of the major pathogens, you know, norovirus, that we're looking at preventing the spread of through both food and through person-to-person contact. So when we look at personnel qualifications and training, we're looking at who is in charge of food safety on your farm. Do you have a designated food safety person? And if you're a very small farm, it's probably you. You're probably the one doing this. In larger farms, they will have someone that is their primary job, to be in charge of food safety. It's a really good idea, no matter how small your farm is, even if there's only 2 of you on your farm, designate which individual will be that point of contact and responsible for designing and implementing your food safety program on your farm. And this could just be, this is the person that gets contacted, this is the person that double checks some of these things, or this is the person that keeps track of the important records. So if we look at human worker health, hygiene, and training, so these 2 things are pretty linked. It's important to train everyone on your farm's food safety policies and practices. And you might say, well, we don't have any policies and practices. Well, that's a really good place to start. Take a look at your operation and really start to focus on what are our food safety policies and practices? What do we do to ensure that our produce is as safe from contamination as we can possibly make it? And if there are certain things that we do just naturally, put them down on paper and make sure that everyone on the farm is on board and understands that this is how you do business on your farm. And when we say everyone, we don't just mean you, your farm partners, and your employees. We mean everybody. We mean the family, if they live on the farm. We mean any employees, whether they're seasonal or year-round, whether they're interns or apprentices. We also mean your customers, especially if your customers are coming onto the farm for any reason, whether they're coming on the farm to pick up their share, or if you have a U-pick or a farm stand, and visitors to the farm. So this could be, you know, if you have a one-day farm event once a year, a harvest festival, or if you just regularly have people coming out to the farm. Everyone who sets foot on your farm should understand some real basics. If you want to go a little farther, and if you were to be compliant under the rule fully, you would document these trainings and have sign-in sheets for visitors. So that's not going to be required for a qualified exempt grower, but it's not a bad idea to have sign-in sheets, and at the very least to have information posted for visitors. So this is really important. Small farms are often a big part of the community, and as such, many small farms welcome the public or customers onto their farm. And this is a great way to really build that engagement and to help people learn where food's coming from and to have that greater respect for you and your farm. But you also don't want them to be increasing any of your food safety risks because they don't know how to behave on a farm. So when you do have visitors come to the farm, make sure that they know where the toilet and hand washing facilities are located and that they are expected to wash their hands after using the toilet facilities. Letting them know what activities are allowed or not allowed. You know, are they allowed to bring pets onto the farm? Most farms do not allow this, and with good reason. Are they allowed to eat or to do other things or to smoke? What areas of the farm are off limits? This is important. You can certainly say that all production areas are off limits. You know, don't go walking into the field and poke at things. Do you require any kind of sanitation or protective gear for visitors to your farm? Do you have hair or beard nets, boot covers, etc.? Do you expect them to bring those with them, or do you provide them? And these may be a little bit over the top, but think about it. If you are doing any kind of food production on your farm, or if you have an integrated system with livestock and crops, it might be really important to not do any kind of cross-contamination. And especially if you have livestock on your farm, and any of your visitors might also be coming from a farm or a property that has animals, it's a good idea to think about some of that biosecurity. And then you can use signage if appropriate. If people are going to see them and read them, you can post signs on your farm. So next we'll talk a little bit about water. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because water is such a diverse topic and there are so many different ways that we address this, especially in the Western United States with our irrigation. But the way that the rule defines it, there's agricultural water. And this part of the rule talks about agricultural water for farms. And the key takeaway is that these rules have not yet been finalized. So we don't know what the final rule is going to be on water. So the way that we teach it now is we just teach what is currently in the rule. But be aware that that may change in the future. So the rule talks about two different kinds of agricultural water. It talks about water in the field and water outside of the field. So in the field, we're talking about any water that's used in production that is likely to contact the produce. And this includes irrigation water if the irrigation water is contacting the harvestable portions of the crop. And it also includes any kind of water in spray mixes or freeze control or anything else that you are applying to the crop during the growing season. And all agricultural water must be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. Now, this is not saying that all water used in the field needs to be potable water. There are some very specific recommendations for the bacteria or coliform count in agricultural water used on crops. And there are some recommendations for what to do if the water does not meet those minimum requirements. And there are some testing requirements currently in the rule. And some of these is what is expected to change, but probably testing in itself is not at all going to go away. But the rule does set some minimum standards for irrigation water quality and some testing no matter the source. The rule also talks about agricultural water after harvest. So this is defined as water that comes in contact with fresh produce during and after harvest. So this could be anything that you are using water for: rinsing, washing, moving produce, so conveyance of produce, cooling, ice making, any post-harvest fungicide and wax applications, and then hand washing for anyone working with the crop during and after harvest. And this is really important, and the reason that we talk so much about it is because water can easily become contaminated with pathogens that make humans sick. And it's very easy to transmit these pathogens to produce when the produce is also coming in contact with this water. And this is the part, or these are the tasks when you only can use potable water. So potable water in the terms of the rule is anything that is free from any detectable E. coli. And so usually if you are using like city water or domestic well water that's been tested, these are going to qualify for potable water. But you would certainly never use any kind of surface water or irrigation canal water to do post-harvest activities. And I just wanted to really quickly show this graphic. This is the risk of contamination from ag water. So the higher risk of contamination is going to be coming from surface water. So these are your ponds, your lagoons, your streams, your irrigation ditches. And that's because this water is exposed to all of the elements, right? Animals can walk into this water. Animals can die in this water. This water is subject to runoff and erosion. Your groundwater, this is here in the middle, depending on how deep your wells are or how you're accessing them or who else is accessing them, these are going to be kind of in the middle of risk potential. And then your public water supply. So this is a water supply that is managed by a city or a town. It is continually treated. It is continually tested. This is going to be your safest bet and the lower risk of contamination. However, for most farms, it is not at all economically sustainable to use public water supply for irrigation purposes. So that's why we realize that irrigation water has certain risks. But you really have to use it in some situations. But for anything post-harvest, you're going to use that public water supply or water that has been treated. So how to reduce your risk when water is concerned? So know your water, know where it comes from. Test your water. So we can have another webinar on testing your irrigation water. It's a little bit more complicated. But if you are using public water for anything, just keep those records if they're mailed out to you by the water company. We really recommend that you test your well water annually, and that's for your own personal health, but also for the pathogens if you're using it in agriculture. And consider testing your irrigation water throughout the season. It really wouldn't hurt to know what is in that water, and I know that it's going to change from day to day. You may just want to do one test pre-season, a test mid-season, and a test later in the season. And you would contact your state extension or Department of Agriculture or FSMA regulator to find out a little bit more about how to do that. And then protect your water. Look at your water system. How can you manage waste, livestock, and wildlife to avoid any kind of contamination of your surface water? Inspect your well and your wellhead and think about practices that keep all your water safe. All right, so next we're going to talk about the biological soil amendments. So here we've got some compost being made. So this part of the rule talks about soil amendments, and it also talks about human waste, which may or may not be anything that you consider or talk about on your farm. But it covers the use of these amendments, particularly manures, composts, compost and manure teas, and other biological amendments. So it talks about how to make them, where to keep them, how to apply them, and how to reduce risk. And why are we concerned with these specifically? Well, and that's because animal manures often contain bacteria, viruses, or parasites, and they can make people sick, especially if they're used as an amendment in their raw state, if they're applied to the edible portion of the growing crops when they're in their raw state, if they come in contact with hands, clothes, shoes, equipment, tools, or fresh produce, and if they're stored in a way that allows for leaching, drift, or runoff into production fields or into surface water. So they are an important source of contamination, and it's very important to keep them from contaminating. So how do you reduce the risk on your farm? Well, first of all, never use human waste to fertilize crops. There is some allowance for composted human waste to be used on food crops if it follows certain EPA guidelines. But in all the times I've ever talked, nobody has ever said that they want to do this. So just a blanket recommendation would be just don't do it. If you're going to be composting on farm and you want to use your compost within a day or two of planting, or if you want to apply it to the edible portions of crops, then you need to decompost that manure using a scientifically valid method. Now, the rule does not require that you compost this way on your farm, but if you're going to use compost very, very close to harvest or on edible portions, then you do need to follow this. Or if you are purchasing compost, that you ask for documentation as to the method of composting used. Now, if you don't compost according to this scientifically valid method, or if your compost company cannot give you that documentation, or if you are just dealing with a large amount of manure, the way to handle that is to allow a time interval of 90 to 120 days between application and harvest. So this would be, applying any of those products 90 days before harvest for something that is maybe growing underground or not touching the ground, and then 120 days between application and the harvest of any kind of produce item that does touch the ground or come in contact with that material. And then the rule also talks about ways to store, manage, and transport both raw and treated soil amendments. And so treated just means that it's been composted in that appropriate method. But you want to keep them separate, and you want to handle them separately so that you don't cross-contaminate. And so speaking of manures, let's talk a little bit about animals. Now, many small farms integrate crops and livestock, and it's a very good idea biologically, to produce some of the fertilizer that your plants are going to need. And it's also a way to diversify your enterprises. But let's talk a little bit about some of the risks associated with the combination. So we do know that animals of all kinds are typically a constant presence on a small farm, whether they're livestock that's being raised, whether they are working animals, whether they're farm pets. And then many farms do have increased pressure and presence of wildlife, especially as we continue to urbanize. So we're concerned because animals and their waste products can be a key source of contamination for fresh produce. And so you want to look at what are the potential sources for animal intrusion or contamination on your farm, right? What are the animals that either are present or likely to be present on your farm? What kind of risk do they pose? And what can you possibly do to mitigate that? And can conservation and farming coexist? Absolutely. And the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, has a number of resources available about co-management. So this is managing your farm for food safety without eliminating or becoming detrimental to the wildlife that exists in your area. So it is possible. So just to manage your risk from animals, like I said, know about your risks. What animals are likely to be there, what do they pose as far as a risk, and develop a plan, whether it's, no pets in the field, while the crop is growing, or, we're separating the animal areas so that there isn't a chance of manures blowing in or running in with water. So what is your plan? If you can exclude wildlife, livestock, birds, and pets whenever you can from areas that are growing produce crops, that's a good idea. You may not be able to do this 100%. And so if you can't, make sure that you're inspecting your crops regularly during the growing season, and especially at pre-harvest for any signs of intrusion or contamination. Mark those areas off and think about not harvesting that portion of the crop. And this is really important. Do not pick poop. We go over this even in our trainings for the large scale growers. So train yourself, your workers, anybody who's going to be harvesting to leave contaminated produce in the field. Don't touch it, don't harvest it, don't contaminate your harvest baskets with it. So let's talk in the last bit of our presentation today, we're going to talk about sanitation and a few other things. So this is what happens from harvest to market, keeping that whole process as clean as possible. So this is going to cover how your produce is handled as it travels from the field to the end consumer. And this is vitally important. You've done all these other things right from the start, with your soil and your water. And now it comes to the time when that produce is going to be handled the most by humans. So there are lots of ways, lots of opportunities along the way for produce to become contaminated with pathogens during these activities. So think a lot about how is your produce harvested? How is it handled? Is it cooled or not? Is it washed or not? Is it packaged? Where is it stored? And how is it transported or displayed? And where along this chain could there be potential for contamination, and how are you going to avoid that? And then what are you going to do if something does happen? So what are the risks associated with each step? And we are going to have an entire webinar just on sanitation and harvest and post-harvest. So we're not going to go into it now other than It's something to start thinking about as you are gearing up for your production season, or you're already in your production season, looking at your risk at each step of the way. So some things to really focus on are going to be any kind of surface that comes in contact with fresh produce, or potentially could come in contact with fresh produce. So this is going to be any of your harvest tools or totes, your tables, your conveyor belts, storage bins, packaging materials, storage racks, both where you're storing materials and produce, any of your coolers, and don't forget the very important worker hands, worker clothing, aprons, gloves, walls, ceilings, and floors of where you do your harvest and pack activities. So can these things be adequately cleaned, and if and when necessary, can they be sanitized? And these are really important questions to ask, and if the answer is continually no, you might want to look at changing some of the way that you do things. Pest management is another part of sanitation and post-harvest. So it's really important to have some kind of pest management plan, especially if you have enclosed or interior packing, storage, or cooling facilities, right? So how are you going to keep rodents, birds, and insects out of those areas and the potential risk that they might pose if they are there? So you can do this by maintaining a regular schedule of inspection. Maybe you're doing some trapping and removing, and you could keep records. You know, how often do you scout for pests? What do you find? What do you do if they're there? All right, and so this brings us to the last section, and this is your record keeping. So here's a record keeping checklist. So if you are a farm that is not covered by the rule, right? So your sales are $25,000 or less, dating from January 2016, you just need to keep sales documents or tax information showing that that is the case, and that you are not covered by the rule because you just aren't selling the minimum amount of produce. If you are also growing for processing, you need to keep that documentation too, and I don't have a slide specifically on that, but we can direct you to some resources. But number one, just keep those sales documents showing that you are making less than $25,000. So if you're going to be a qualified exempt farm, right, so you need to keep a few other records. You need to have sales or tax documents that show that your total food sales average under $500,000 per year over 3 years. And this isn't just adjusted for inflation. And we can point you to some, if you're kind of on the line there, we can point you to some resources so you know exactly what those numbers are going to be. If you're nowhere near the 500,000, then you probably don't have to adjust it for inflation as much. But you need to keep those sales and tax documents documenting your total food sales. And you need to keep documentation that you were selling 50% or more directly to a qualified end user, right? And so those were the co-ops, the CSAs, farmers markets, restaurants, retail grocers. And then those are the parts that you need to have now and dating back until 2016. But what you want to get ready for next year is that you are also going to prominently and conspicuously display your farm name and business address at your point of sale by 2020. So right now you just need the sales documents and the documents that show who you sell to. And again, not like the individual, you know, I sell to Mrs. Robertson. No, you just have to have, you know, these were the types of sales that I made. And then starting in 2020, prominently and conspicuously display your farm name and business address at point of sale. And just here's an example, right? So you have a sign, you have cards, you put this on a label on anything that is going to a co-op or to a grocery store. And there it is, your company name, your business address, and a way to contact you. And so this is to be displayed at farmers markets, farm stands, CSA pickup, or included in your produce delivery beginning January 1st, 2020. And many of you are probably already doing this because you want your customers to know who you were and to come back to you. So it's a good thing. So a little bit more about records and farm food safety plans. So the produce safety rule does not require a farm to have a food safety plan. Now, if you're GAP certified or going through another third-party audit, you may have a food safety plan, and that may be a requirement. FSMA and the produce safety rule do not require you to have a food safety plan. However, we always recommend that you put one together anyway. And that's because a written plan really can help you with the following things. It can help you keep organized and focused on food safety. It can help you have a written record of what are the practices and policies on your farm. What are those standard operating procedures? So if you have visitors to the farm, if you hire someone new, if you are sick and someone else needs to take over for you, they know all of this and they have it in front of them and it's not locked in your brain and accessible. It also helps you keep track of important records and put them all in one place, you know, so that if you do have to document that you're qualified exempt, if you do have to go back and track something, it's all right there. And then you also might know what to do if a situation does occur. You know, do you have any worst case scenarios planned out or records that help you to know what would happen in that situation? So just to summarize, the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act and the Produce Safety Rule do affect farms of all sizes. Nobody is too small to be exempt from food safety, though you might be too small to be covered by the rule. Some very, very small farms are not going to be covered at all, and we talked about what some of those were. But some farms are going to be eligible for a qualified exemption, and it doesn't mean that they can ignore the rule. They do have to follow some of those modified requirements, and they are primarily the records that we just talked about on the previous slide. But I think as we go forward, all farms are going to continue to be under pretty intense pressure and scrutiny to grow, harvest, and sell safe food to customers. And I don't know any farmer that doesn't want to do that. I think where farmers what they don't want to do is have undue regulatory pressure or spend more money than they have on certain things. But there are ways to make all farm operations safe, and often it's just very minor changes, and often it's just in some of the ways that we do things. It's sometimes not even in our facilities, it's just in our practices. So if you're interested in this, you want to learn more, this is the website that we have developed for this 4-state team looking at food safety in the Pacific Northwest. And again, we're collaborating to prepare small-scale growers and food processors for FSMA, for both Produce Safety Rule and the Preventative Controls for Human Food Rule. And this is a grant funded project. We've got one more year of it. Our website is pnwfoodsafety.org. We don't have everything on the website yet in terms of state resources, but we have contact for every state. And we also have the schedule for this ongoing webinar course series. So this would be a way for you to get a pretty comprehensive food safety course just by attending as many of these webinars as you can. And they're primarily on Mondays and Tuesdays, going all the way through the middle end of June. So again, that was pnwfoodsafety.org. And I really encourage you to check it out, reach out to us, and continue learning about how you can be more food safe on your farm. A little bit more about Cultivating Success, who has been our very gracious and generous host for this website, or this webinar series, cultivatingsuccess.org. And then if you're in Idaho, we do have a site specifically about FSMA and the Produce Safety Rule, and that is uidaho.edu/extension/food safety for produce growers. It's often easier just to Google that and get that information. And then the next steps, we do have a post-webinar evaluation. This is the web address of it. It'll be sent out to you via email as well. We really encourage some feedback so we know how to improve these webinars and if there are other topics of interest to you. And then there's my contact information if you want to reach out to me directly. But I wanted to know if we have any questions from today's webinar.
There aren't any questions yet.
Okay.
We have a few people on the webinar today.
Okay. Well, and there is a lot to take in. You know, an hour is not really long enough to talk about all of this stuff. So if you do have questions that you think of later, or you have questions that you just don't feel comfortable sharing in a public forum like a webinar, please visit any of the websites that we listed, or email me directly, and we'll try to track down the answer for you. Again, the goal from the extension side and the university side is just on education. We want you to understand as much as possible about these rules. We want you to protect your farm and your farm business, and we want to help you navigate the regulatory landscape. We are not going to be the regulators. That is going to be the Departments of Agriculture or FDA. We're just really here to instruct and to assist. So if we don't have any questions, then we'll go ahead and end the webinar. And I want to thank you all very much for spending an hour with us talking about this pretty intimidating subject. And we hope to see you on the subsequent webinars.
Thank you, Ariel.
Thank you, Amanda.